Hi everyone. Today we'll be talking about the social determinants of adolescent mental health in Newham, East London. And this is a Kailo consortium project, and the speakers here today are Muskan, Hafsa, and me, Karis. It is 3 dissertations supervised by Professor Peter Fonagy as well as Thomas Booker. So today there'll be 4 parts to today's presentation. First, we'll talk about Kailo, and then we'll go through each of our dissertations. A bit of background on Kailo. Evidence has shown that poor adolescent mental health is on the rise. 15% of young people aged 11 to 19-year-olds face a probable mental health disorder, and this is further exacerbated by inequalities such as poverty and racial minority status. In response, the UK Prevention and Research and Partnership has provided Kailo a £5.3 million funding to mitigate these growing rates. The focus here is on prevention, as previous interventions tend to be reactive or remedial in nature. Additionally, Kailo comes from the Greek origins meaning whole or healthy. Thus, the consortium emphasizes co-design, such that a multidisciplinary team is teaming up with young people and local stakeholders who will have a say in developing this framework rather than academics disseminating top-down theories. Similarly, Kailo consists of the multidisciplinary team, as I said, that brings together both academic and practical expertise and is overall led by Professor Peter Fonagy. The 5-year timeline is broken down into 3 phases, and we are currently in phase 1, which focuses on understanding what matters and what works for young people's mental health. Thus, the 3 of us here were given the opportunity to choose an area of interest to investigate in Newham specifically, which brings me to my dissertation, Adolescent Social Capital and Mental Health. Now, social capital is broadly defined as the networks, norms, and social trust that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit. While not an explanatory theory, the benefit of using social capital framework is that it acknowledges how one's social environment plays a role in one's mental health and physical health, as well as overall community prosperity. Coming in as an international student with no in-person knowledge of Newham, I wanted a framework to understand how adolescent social networks and ties to the community would influence their mental health. Thus, I formulated 3 research questions. What types of relationships and which aspect of the wider Newham community plays a role in adolescents' mental health? And on a more theoretical level, I wanted to see what extent could SC theory help identify and interpret these factors. So I recruited 12 participants through a mixture of cold emailing local organizations and schools, as well as going down there to talk to young people. They took part in semi-structured interviews, and I used a topic guide adapted from previous studies on social capital. However, participants were also given free rein to discuss whatever they were interested about. These interviews were audio-recorded and transcribed, and I used thematic analysis to code the results. So the first theme that emerged pertained to participants' tight-knit network of family and friends. This network were participants' first support network, and it helped both their mental and physical well-being. At the same time, this network held its negative impacts, such as when friends were bad influences on participants and would egg them on to do fraud stuff and drug dealing. The second theme that emerged were the pros and cons of social media. The pros consisted of social media being a tool to maintain connections, such as when participants' friends moved away from them, or to forge new connections. So 2 of my participants were actually influencers on social media, and one of them felt that when bigger YouTubers messaged him, he felt like he was part of that online community. The cons of social media were that there were safety issues in terms of privacy, as well as it inducing social comparisons. As one participant put it, they were constantly seeing other people's lives, and comparison is the thief of joy. The third theme was that there were mixed perceptions towards the wider community. Firstly, most participants were aware that Newham had high crime rates, but this unfortunately led to a sense of desensitization towards the crime that was happening around them. Secondly, there was an acknowledgement of a poor physical environment, such as suspicious strangers on the street or even just the litter scattered around. It made participants feel like they had to be on guard a lot of time, and it also led to them having doubts concerning local authorities. One participant thought that the Newham Council was incompetent because they pledged to introduce food bins but never did, or to clean up the streets, yet the litter on the street was evidence that it was not done. As well as to other community members, there were varied attitudes. Some participants felt that you couldn't trust anyone as everyone was out for themselves and would trick them for money, whereas other participants felt like they could trust community members, but this was spoken specifically about neighbors. And as one participant talked about, she and her neighbors actually threw a get well soon party for one of their neighbors who actually had cancer at the time. Lastly, the last theme was talking about the current and potential community resources for adolescents' mental health. Firstly, schools were pinpointed as advocates for mental health because there were pre-existing programs such as drop-down days where participants could talk about their mental health, as well as really kind teachers who participants felt like they were close to and felt supported by. At the same time, half of participants were actually calling for more organization and community building opportunities, as they acknowledged that these opportunities would help young people stay off the streets and also away from bad influences such as crime or gangs, which in itself is a community. As a quick summary, the main buffers of adolescent mental health were their family and friends, as well as schools and teachers. Whereas the negative factors included the crime rates, physical surroundings, doubts in authorities, and social comparisons made on social media. Pertaining to the last research question that I had, I found that social capital theory did not really account for several things that came out spontaneously, such as the use of social media, which is concerning considering young people have an incredible dependence on online communications nowadays, as well as the impact of physical surroundings in mental health. It also did not acknowledge the intersection of gender and ethnicity in terms of adolescents' mental health and ties to the community. For example, female participants were more worried about sexual harassment, and participants from racial minority backgrounds actually had more doubts concerning the local police because of the recent Black Lives Matter movement. Additionally, social capital studies in the past typically do not recruit young people as participants, so there's not much literature on school-based settings. Yet my dissertation has managed to pinpoint schools as a potential resource to tap into. Overall, however, I found that adolescents are incredibly self-aware of what affects their mental health and are also proactive when it comes to deciding what they will let affect their mental health. And I believe that in the future, policymakers and researchers would do well to heed their advice. And now passing on the time on to Muskan.
Hello everyone, so my name is Muskan and my dissertation specifically focused on South Asian female adolescents' perception on their housing insecurity related pressures and how it affects their mental health. So there was a couple of reasons why I chose to focus on South Asian female adolescents. So first of all, most recent research on Newham shows that the South Asian demographic as well as the female demographic have the worst mental health in Newham. Secondly, there isn't much research on this specific demographic in relation to housing insecurity or even the mental health in general. And finally, because I myself am a South Asian female, I really wanted to make my dissertation focus on something that I'm very passionate about and I have first-hand experience. And I chose housing insecurity specifically because research has consistently shown that housing insecurity has negative impact on mental health, as well as that Newham has consistently been negatively affected by housing insecurity problems ever since 2012 from the Olympics. So housing insecurity is just anything that consists of, for example, overcrowding, poor housing quality, even difficulty paying rent. So any problems related to housing comes under housing insecurity. So taking all of that in mind, I came up with two research questions. So the first research question I wanted to focus on is how exactly does housing insecurity impact adolescent mental health, specifically South Asian female adolescents? And then I also wanted to see whether South Asian female adolescents attribute their mental health problems to these housing insecurities. So to do this, I came up with this is my data collection and data analysis method. So just in summary, I conducted a 45-minute semi-structured interview. And then from that transcript, I conducted a thematic analysis. And then from that, I created 5 themes, which can be seen here. So these are my 5 themes, and I'll just go through some of them in depth. So for the first theme, I focused on neighborhood. So neighborhood played a big role in Newham, and this is broken down into 2 sub-themes. So firstly, community support played a major role. And this theme consisted of participants speaking about how Newham has a large South Asian community, and they found it, as you can see in the quote, comfortable. And this taps into kind of their sense of belongingness in Newham and how they feel kind of at home when they are in Newham and they're walking around Newham. But then on the flip side, many participants, being young females, felt unsafe in Newham, and this can be seen in the perception of safety sub-theme. They'd always have to go out with someone or let someone know when they're going out. So this kind of also made them feel isolated, and it made them feel that they had to stay within their household and they couldn't walk around in Newham. So although neighborhood does have some positive impacts, it also had some negative impacts on participants. The second theme is overcrowding. So I focused on 2 types of overcrowding. So overcrowding when there's too many people in the house, and overcrowding as well as when there is not enough people, not enough space in the house, sorry. And both had negative impacts to mental health. It caused a lot of anxiety at home, with lots of conflict within family members, also caused embarrassment because a lot of participants were very embarrassed of bringing friends over to their house. And in turn, it just caused a lot of, again, feelings of isolation, anxiety, and stress, all related to living in a very small household. The next theme that I wanted to go through was social support. So participants only felt social support if it was from someone who was the same age as them, was from Newham, from a South Asian background, and this was mainly provided by friends from who come under this demographic, as well as when it comes from family, it only came from cousins and not any other family members. So friends and cousins were very important to provide social support, and participants felt very comfortable talking to them about their housing problems and felt very comfortable confiding in them. The fourth theme was extended family. So I personally find this theme the most interesting because I think on one hand, there is quite a lot of literature on this, but also it's a very diverse theme, so it hasn't been touched on a lot. So in terms of proximity, there's a lot of research on proximity. So a lot of research has supported what I found, which is that extended family are only helpful if they're in close proximity. So participants found that if the extended family live in Newham or live in a borough close to Newham, then they can be helpful in terms of in-care support, emotional support, any other type of support. However, if they live further away, maybe out of London, out of UK, even in a different country, extended family actually have a negative impact then rather than a positive, which leads me to my second sub-theme, which is on native countries. So a lot of participants, in fact, felt shame or guilt associated to talking with their extended family from their native country, because a lot of the participants' family were from suppose a third world country, so they didn't feel comfortable talking to their family about their problems living in the UK. They felt a bit guilty talking about it because, as they said in the quote, there's this idea that just because you live in the UK, you're in a better situation. And so they didn't feel like they had a right to complain. So I personally did not find much research on this. And I think it's a very interesting idea to look into in the future. And moving on to my last theme, affordability issues. This was a really, really big theme. And this consists of 4 sub-themes. So the first sub-theme would be age and financial pressures, which just talks about how older participants felt that they had more responsibility when it came to financial decisions in their household, particularly if they were the eldest English speaker in the house. They felt like they had to manage the household finances, which definitely had a negative impact to their mental health. Another sub-theme would be cost of living. So because of the current cost of living crisis, participants could feel a change in their household. They could feel like they had to now be more aware of their spendings. They also felt that their parents were working more often, and all of this negatively impacted their relationship with their family, again, making them feel very isolated and anxious about the future. However, some participants did feel motivated, as you can see in the third sub-theme. They felt motivated by their situation. Some said that it helped them aspire for a well-paying job in the future. Their current situation helped them concentrate in school more. But at the same time, a lot of them knew that as South Asian females, they had lots of barriers. So this moves on to the fourth sub-theme about cultural barriers. So they, as can be seen in the quote, they think that anything that involves the house, so for example, housework, chores, bills, maintaining the house order, affected South Asian females more in the house than it did South Asian males. So they had the additional responsibility of managing maybe work, university, school, as well as household problems, which definitely negatively impacted their mental health and gave them an additional strain to think about. And just to summarize all of that information, so I found that there were different ways that housing insecurity impacts mental health, particularly unsafe neighborhood, prejudice and judgment, and gender inequalities in South Asian communities negatively impacts South Asian girls' mental health. However, at the same time, social support from friends, family, and the community, as well as having strong aspirations, positively impacted my participants' mental health. And I just want to finally highlight that, much like Harris's research, I also found that adolescents are very aware of how their housing impacts their mental health, and they are very passionate about speaking about how their social and cultural background impacts their mental health, and they're very willing to speak about it. And I definitely think this has important treatment and preventative care implications, and can be taken into consideration when creating new treatment plans or new preventative care plans, particularly for this demographic. So that's it for my presentation. I'm just going to hand it over to Hafsa now.
Thank you so much, Muskan. So unlike Harris and Muskan's projects who looked at adolescent mental health, I actually decided to explore the parental perspective on mental health and help seeking, and particularly the factors that parents perceive as mental health facilitators and barriers. I explored parents because parents are going to be living in the same household as the adolescents, particularly through the adolescent years. You know, adolescents haven't moved out at that age yet. So I thought it was really important to explore how parents define mental health, how they define help seeking, and also what they perceived as help seeking facilitators and barriers. Most of the research which has looked at help seeking facilitators and barriers previously has explored Caucasian parents, whether that be in Australia or whether that be in South London. I therefore identified that there was a lack of cultural diversity when it came to exploring mental health and help seeking. So I knew that as a Pakistani adult myself, I also want to explore the South Asian perspective particularly. We identified Newham as the most culturally diverse borough in Newham, and within Newham, Bangladeshi and Indian populations are quite prevalent. Furthermore, Indian adolescents do have a mental health advantage when it comes to externalizing behaviors in comparison to Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Caucasian adolescents. Therefore, I decided to compare Bangladeshi and Indian parents and explore how they perceived mental health and help seeking. Importantly, I also wanted to explore the non-clinical perspective. What I mean by that is typically when help-seeking facilitators and barriers are explored, they're typically looked at when parents have explained, okay, I sought help for my adolescent previously. This is what my experience was. So this is what the help-seeking facilitators were. This is what the barriers were. But there's not much literature in terms of what parents thought when they hadn't previously sought help for their adolescents. So I thought it was really important to explore whether such parents had different views or whether the views of clinical adolescent parents and non-clinical adolescent parents were similar. This led me to a broad research question to explore how Bangladeshi and Indian parents of adolescents living in Newham perceive mental health and help seeking, whereby my first research question looked at definitions of mental health and help seeking, and the second question explored how the facilitators and barriers of help seeking. So with regard to the methodology, I conducted 5 semi-structured interviews. 4 of them were online, 1 of them was in person. 3 of my participants were recruited from Newham Collegiate Sixth Form, and 2 of the participants were recruited from widespread WhatsApp messages. As you can see on the slides, there was quite a widespread recruitment strategy in person as well, but most of my participants, of course, were recruited just from schools. My interview guidelines were developed from Kailo question guides of adolescents and parents, as well as my own questions and previous literature, which explored the South Asian perspective on eating disorders, as well as the role of faith, the role of mental health stigma, and the role of parents. I audio recorded and transcribed the interviews and used a thematic analysis. And I'm now going to discuss the themes that I obtained. So this is a theme map of all of the themes that I obtained from my interviews. There were 5 themes, the first of which looked at defining mental health and help seeking. When it came to mental health, parents typically defined it as a balance, so a balance between happy and sad emotions and a balance between various life events. So being able to manage the different life events and being able to say, okay, do you know what, this is going to pass, and being able to kind of overcome those difficult emotions in difficult times. Parents did understand that parents were absolutely imperative when it came to the help-seeking process. They acknowledged that they need to first recognize that there's a problem and then encourage their adolescent to seek help, and parental conduct, whether that be parents kind of dismissing mental health concerns or parents themselves stigmatizing mental health, that did affect whether an adolescent then went on to seek help. But the 3 themes that I really do want to focus on are the conflicting role of faith in help seeking, stigma, and crucial improvements which I needed to encourage help seeking. So theme 3, which was the conflicting role of faith in help seeking, was probably the most diverse. So I thought I would address that first of all. One view was that faith came before professionals. And what I mean is 4 of my participants identified as Bangladeshi Muslims. So therefore, when I refer to faith here, I do refer to Muslim scholars and the Islamic faith. Parents suggested that going to Islamic faith leaders would be the immediate reaction. That's because in Newham, faith and culture are often intertwined, and parents perceived that faith leaders would be more understanding of the social and cultural context that an adolescent is going through, and therefore they thought it was best to approach a faith leader as well. Parents perceived that Islam was actually a framework, it was a network, it was a guideline of how an adolescent should be living their life, and if they were following this, then really they shouldn't be falling off the edge, they shouldn't be having these negative feelings, they shouldn't be struggling with their mental health. So therefore, to kind of get the adolescent back on track, the parents perceived that going to a faith leader was going to be the most practical thing, and really the safest option for them to do. And it's also the easiest access because there were plenty of mosques and plenty of faith leaders that they could approach, even when they're going for their daily prayers as well. However, parents did identify that imams might not be the best person for parents to actually approach. They suggested that, these faith leaders can just take their money and not really do anything to help the adolescent themselves, and in turn the adolescent's mental health can actually dwindle even more. It can be even worse and take the adolescent away from their faith because they've seen that the faith leader won't really do anything to help their mental health itself. And then we came on to sort of the idea that faith and help seeking are not really intertwined. So some of my participants suggested that, God isn't going to come down to actually help us. So it's really important to actually go to a mental health professional on this earth, and therefore mental health and spirituality, they can connect, but it's important to not necessarily rely on faith leaders and instead go to the mental health professionals who are trained in doing this. So therefore mental health and help seeking should kind of be kept away from faith itself. With regard to theme 4, which was stigma, this kind of idea of social standing, of pride was a really big concept from all of my participants. So participants suggested that if somebody found out in the local community that there was an adolescent in their household who was struggling with their mental health, it would affect their social standing. It would affect how they are respected in society. You know, people would be gossiping, people would be talking about them. And as you can see here, it's quite a distressing quote, you know, mad child in the house. You know, parents were quite afraid of kind of being referred to that as being that house that with the adolescent who's not coping very well. And therefore it all did boil down to control and honor and dignity. I think this is exacerbated particularly by the Newham demographics itself. So in Newham, parents emphasize that families often live quite close to each other. Neighbors are often family friends, or people kind of know each other on the roads. If people don't live next to each other, then they are on, you know, kind of different neighborhoods. You know, everybody lives really close together. And therefore, if somebody did find out again that a child was struggling with their mental health, then that would again boil down to culture, to honor and dignity, and therefore they would be exposed. And also a lot of the women in Newham who are, so mothers particularly, they don't actually work. And therefore, when adolescents might be trying to explain that, you know, these are the issues that they're facing, it could be that the mothers are not actually understanding. Of course, there is a language barrier as well, whereby the South Asian languages don't actually have the vocabulary for things like mental health, help seeking, depression, anxiety. And therefore, if the parents are approaching their parents, if the adolescents are approaching their parents for mental health support, then it could be that the parents are not actually understanding the concepts that their children are actually trying to explain to them, and therefore the parents can't then be facilitating the help-seeking process itself. Also, as the women don't work, they don't really get exposure to the triggers that are outside. So, for example, social media, for example, bullying, things that can be affecting adolescent mental health. Therefore, if they don't understand it, then they can't really facilitate the help-seeking process. And if mothers, for example, do want to access support, then it's a very patriarchal society, whereby the fathers might just say, do you know what, no, like we're going to take the child to the mosque, for example, or, you know, no, we can't actually discuss this whatsoever. So the Newham demographics were definitely propelling mental health stigma and prevention of help-seeking. With regard to crucial improvements, parents did identify that practical concerns as well when it came to help seeking, for example. So whereby the waiting list could be over 12 months, you know, they are time bound, they're only effective if you follow everything that the treatment is asking you to do. One participant did suggest that talking therapies are rubbish. This was the quote from them, because she said that all it was going to be the adolescent is discussing their mental health concerns with somebody that they've never spoken to before. And really, if you're going to pay somebody to speak to them, then you might as well just speak to the people that you've got at home. It's more practical and it's just easier for everybody. With regard to an ideal help-seeking process, participants outlined a view of more in a way having like a social support group. So if you have adolescents who have gone through the help-seeking process with their parents, they can have a nice setting, for example, in a community center, whereby they can discuss with adolescents who are currently struggling with their mental health, as well as the parents, and they can kind of use each other's experiences to discuss how to get through that difficult time, as well as having sort of interventions that are catered to the individual's beliefs and backgrounds. So mental health professionals need to understand the social context that adolescents are living in, you know, as Muskan mentioned, sort of social overcrowding, social media, as Karis mentioned. So yeah, mental health interventions do need to be catered a little bit more, and just having something more localized, which is easier for everybody to access. So with regard to the conclusion, I didn't necessarily find anything that distinctly set parents in Newham aside from non-clinical adolescent parents, as well as Caucasian parents. So the help-seeking facilitators and barriers I identified, so for example, the role of parents, parents being understanding, parental conduct affecting help-seeking, practical constraints, not understanding necessarily what mental health is, not understanding what help-seeking is, that was all prominent prominent in parents of non-clinical adolescents, and it's also prominent in parents of clinical adolescents. So therefore, help-seeking facilitators and barriers do transcend cultural and geographical boundaries, as well as adolescent mental health status. Now, I only had 5 participants, so it is difficult to generalize my findings, but from what I did obtain, this is what I found, that there is nothing in Newham that can distinctly say, okay, this is a reason why adolescents in Newham are not able to speak to their parents, or this is why parents in Newham are reluctant to seek support. So when it comes to the practical implications, as I have mentioned previously, having a localized informal network of individuals with lived experience of mental health, and also getting them involved with faith leaders, making faith leaders more involved in the help-seeking process by helping them to encourage parents to actually access mental health support from professionals. That is something that parents were quite enthusiastic about. They were even giving me different ideas of community spaces that could be used and sort of different ways that parents could get involved, having them in schools, for example, having teachers involved as well. Parents were really, really keen on having this localized informal network, and also having language-specific psychoeducation. So as I've mentioned, there isn't really a word for mental health in many South Asian languages, and therefore for parents to be able to really kickstart that help-seeking process, they need to understand what the mental health concerns are in the first place. And this also links to sort of talking to the grandparents, talking to the older generations who might be more reliant on these South Asian languages, and also more reliant on going to mosques, for example, or gathering in community spaces where their home languages are going to be more prominent. So having language-specific psychoeducation, whereby we can teach generations to sort of communicate better within themselves. So saying, okay, right, this is how we describe mental health, this is how we describe help seeking, this is what their adolescent is feeling, and we need to get support for this, was really, really important. And not just sort of having leaflets, really having a nice conversation with the parents themselves, because of course there is also a stigma of actually going to the GP surgery, for example, and actually picking up that leaflet that might have the language specific information within that. Future research should focus on generational differences. So one of my parents suggested that the older generations are more stigmatizing of mental health, and really that stigmatizing ideas have sort of come over, is what they mentioned. They sort of come over from the older generation. They've been instilled in older generations, and now they are sort of being fed through to the younger generations as well. So therefore we should explore sort of what are the generational differences when it comes to defining mental health, what has shaped the older generation's idea, and how is that changing when it comes to the younger generations as well, as well also focusing on this role of perceived social standing, social status, respect. Why is it that having an adolescent in your household with mental health concerns is going to affect somebody's social standing so much? Why is that such a barrier? I think that's really important, because it was really mentioned by all of my participants, and everybody did mention that, sort of having your family's respect tarnished would be a really, really big barrier as to why parents don't want to seek support. And lastly, if there was a real presentation sort of in an auditorium, you would be able to use this QR code to access the Kailo website. But just from Karis, Muskan, and myself, just a huge thank you to our supervisors, and to our seminar leaders, and just to our peers as well, and also to our participants for taking the time to take part in our projects. We wish Kailo all the very best for the future, and we just hope that the endeavor that they are on is successful. And thank you very much.